When I ask you what's next for Sonic, you all start going crazy, but when I ask you what's next for Amphibia, it feels like nobody's listening. After the release of Sonic Frontiers and its commercial success, everyone's asking the same question that was brought up by Aaron Weber during the 25th anniversary livestream before being cut off while teasing Sonic Mania. What is next for Sonic? This question becomes very common after a game comes out, but this time, it's a very special case. We've just come off of the heels of a game that is supposedly going to be the standard for the next 10 years of modern Sonic games. So the next 2 games. Well, there are many different directions the mainline series could take, but I have my own 2 cents on how I'd move the series forward. In late 2022, Sonic Team dropped Sonic Frontiers. They stated that this game is set to be the standard for the next decade of Sonic games. In this game, you traverse 5 different biomes on the Starfall Islands to help your friends and the other few remaining inhabitants of the islands. There are tons of small obstacle courses for you to interact with to collect items that'll aid you in progressing through the game. When everything necessary is collected, you fight a giant boss of Super Sonic and move on to the next island. This is a really solid gameplay loop to set the standard for the next 10 years. However, there's definitely a lot that needs to be ironed out for this to really rival the best of Sonic's lineage, such as polishing up many of the parts of the game's collision and rendering, making many of the areas feel less automated, and overall making the art style feel more unique and far less realistic looking. Aside from the overall gameplay, the lore team at Sega has been working to unify the Sonic canon, making most of the ongoing series take place in the same timeline. Some of them make sense to take place in the same universe as the video games, like the IDW comics and the many animated shorts on YouTube. However, for the few that work, there are many others that don't fit as well, such as Sonic Prime and its weird interpretation of Sonic's world and Sonic as a character. The games have also been affected by this too, with characters like Tango the Lemur being name-dropped by Sonic when running across the Starfall Islands and Frontiers. All of this is a great start for the next decade, but I do have a few ideas as to how we can go further beyond. For starters, we need to ditch the last generation of consoles. It's become painfully clear that these systems are holding these games back, more specifically the Nintendo Switch. I feel that if the team didn't need to keep this old hardware in mind, the games would have much more to offer compared to the other games of the current generation. If this doesn't fix the pop-in, Sonic Team has officially failed at optimizing their games. Wait, hang on. Oh no! With us ditching the last generation, having all the different locations combined into one loaded island, rather than having you completing each one individually like in Super Mario Odyssey, is something that I would adore to see. When I'm saying this, I'm thinking of something along the lines of Solar Ash, where you can run from one end of the area to another. I would imagine it on a much larger scale, however, where Solar Ash only allows you to enter each location through the center of the map that holds the Star Seed. This hypothetical Sonic game would allow you to traverse through locations through many different means, whether it be through some main area, by reaching rooftops with your momentum to glide over to the other location, or what have you. On top of that, I think that livening these areas with side characters and optional missions to participate in would aid in giving this game more stuff worth doing. Frontiers attempted this by having side conversations with Sonic's friends scattered across the islands, but they felt so shoehorned in and not enough to make the game more replayable. Maybe if Tails was talking to Sonic about why Ollie Chen as a character sucks, I'd be less harsh. Here, I like to imagine something like what actual open world games have, with citizens walking around cities with their own conversations and some offering side missions, like in something like Spider-Man or the remakes of Final Fantasy VII. That alone would immediately give life to a world that I'd be so interested to see populated with loads of knickknacks. Speaking of the world, how would it function with the characters you play as? Well, many Sonic games have very exaggerated interpretations of real-life cities, inserting loops, slopes, and rails into urban-looking towns. I'd personally double down with concepts like this, making buildings more rounded to allow characters to naturally roll down them like hills or run up them. Have small obstacle course-like sections that are actually cohesive where you can access collectibles, tons of runnable walls, loops, and all the other stuff that have made previous city levels so fun to traverse. It wouldn't just be cities though, because you'd obviously have more rural areas. It'd be much easier to insert more fantastic elements into them, since they've been used much more often in the series than any other type of location. Having connected worlds like these with all of this opportunity for movement sounds amazing, but how are you going to traverse them? Of course, you'd mainly be playing as Sonic. However, I'd like to pitch the idea of ditching many of the combat abilities found in Frontiers for him. A lot of it feels very automated, pointless, and kind of kills your flow at times. Is it cool? I mean, yeah, a lot of the camera angles and poses are really neat, and the bosses are incredible set pieces, but being nice to look at and being actively fun to play are completely different things. It's like Sega was making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but only put peanut butter on it and didn't remove the crust. Instead of having Sonic's Frontiers combat, I'd keep things simple and just have a regular homing attack, and maybe some other attack to keep your speed going. To maybe keep some incentive to not just spam, we could have a mechanic where Sonic does more damage depending on how fast he hits an enemy. You know, physics. Sonic in general would have many more movement options. The obvious spin dash, a drop dash, a jump that maintains your acceleration and height. Oh, and no boost. they here now? I thought people wanted this! It's very obvious that Sonic Team is wanting to phase out the boost with more momentum-based abilities without the updates the Frontiers have been looking. So removing the boost here feels like a natural step. Well, if we're gonna give Sonic less combat and more momentum, who do we give the focused combat to? We can't just let the seed that Frontiers plan to go to waste. You're right. Let's burn the seed instead. I've come up with an idea that not only gives characters with actual combat a chance to shine, but also aids in the idea of unifying the canon. In my hypothetical Sonic game, I'd have Tangle and Whisper as side characters. Maybe you could squeeze Lanolin in there as well, but I have literally no idea what you could do with her. She has a bell with a wisp in it. She could make the enemies go deaf or something, I guess. Whisper would use her Wispin for more direct combat. There wouldn't be a skill tree, but I'd still imagine her having multiple different abilities with her wisps that would make each fight against enemies unique. Tangle would be like a mix between Whisper and Sonic. She wouldn't quite match Sonic's mobility or speed, and she'd be nowhere near as combat heavy as Whisper, but she'd still be able to obtain tons of speed from rolling down hills or using her tail to swing from rooftops like in the Spider-Man games. She'd also use that tail for combos in combat, whether it be simple jabs or more in-depth attacks or creative dodging. Still no skill tree though. Can you tell I didn't like that part in Frontiers? Essentially, if you can't tell, I don't want the main group to star in this game. Frontiers heavily implies that Tails, Knuckles, and Amy are going to temporarily go their own separate ways, and I think Sonic working with a different group of characters would be a really interesting twist from the status quo. That doesn't change that Sonic Frontiers would have been a perfect send-off of the series and we could get a Sonic reboot. Sorry, what was I saying? And having IDW characters join in the mix would allow these amazing characters to become relevant to more mainstream audiences, rather than only being relevant to hardcore fans who have to awkwardly sneak around the kids section in Barnes & Noble. That hardcore fan is me, by the way, I didn't know if you could tell. All this brings me into my next main question. What are we gonna do about the story and setting? I beg of you, do not go back to the Starfall Islands, please! A lot of people like to push this agenda for a Sonic Frontiers 2 or something along those lines, and in terms of story and setting, I can't get behind that whatsoever. Frontiers' locations do look nice graphically, but in terms of how Sonic games have looked in the past, the Starfall Islands feel really drab and boring. On top of that, the loads of hastily slapped in rails and platforming challenges disguised by the horrible pop-it make the areas feel incredibly incohesive. The story, I feel, should stay in Frontiers as well. The main idea as to why Sonic was going on the Starfall Islands to begin with, learning the secrets of the Ancients and the origins of the Chaos Emeralds, feels complete. There's absolutely no need to return to what Frontiers planned in those regards. What we should keep from Frontiers, though, is Ian Flynn as the writer. I know a lot of people like to meme on him for slapping flashbacks into Frontiers, but if you take a look at literally any of his other official works, it's actually really well done. Yes, that guy you were talking to the other day was not joking, the bee gets brain damage. It feels like some force, whether that be Sega, Ian himself, or something else, was holding him back while writing Frontiers. Sure, the dialogue is pretty good, but the overall story feels run-of-the-mill and many parts feel underwhelming and undercooked. Letting Ian go all out with the next game like what he did in IDW or Archie would be perfect to show his talents as a writer. I don't have exact ideas for how a story of this hypothetical game would go, but it'd definitely be something with much higher stakes and deeper plot points than what Frontiers had. Not just good dialogue. One last thing. If Frontiers is supposed to be the basis for the next decade of Sonic games, we need to go over one of the main mechanics of the gameplay loop of the open zone in Frontiers, cyberspace. On the Starfall Islands, when you defeat a boss, you obtain a gear. You use that gear to access a cyberspace shrine and access Sonic's memories as short bite-sized stages that are in a similar style to how previous Sonic levels have worked. In a perfect world, I'd gut these entirely. Honestly, I could easily see a gameplay loop without cyberspace-like stages working perfectly fine. The open zone works well enough as is. But if we have to keep these, I'd relegate them to side missions that can give you an edge in obtaining collectibles. I have no idea how they'd fit into the gameplay loop, nor do I really want to, but this works fine, I guess. Overall, that's just one of the many different directions the Sonic series can take with Frontiers as a starting point, which was 13 years after the last starting point, which was 2 years after the last starting point, which was 2 years after the last starting point, which was 17 years before the point was made. Is this pitch perfect? No. Are there spots that could be more fleshed out? Are there parts that may not work in practice? Probably. But this is the impression that Frontiers gives me for showing what the next 10 years could look like. Increasing the scope of the open zone, taking further action to unionize the canon, adding things, removing things are all part of what I believe the series could do next. Or they could just reboot and start the story fresh, but that's a topic for another day. Now, the question must be asked. What will the next game actually be like? Well, let's just say in order for Sonic Team to consistently make great games again, the only first step that's going to be taken is Sega Sammy Holdings' first step into a New York manhole. Into the sewer. To be eaten by crocodiles. The joke is that I hate Sega Sammy as a company, and the lesson is that you should never invest almost your entire business into Blue Arms.